All right, so let's have a look at 3.1.1. What does the key knowledge say? It says we need to know an overview of Australian outdoor environments before humans arrive, and we need to know these three characteristics of biological isolation, geological stability, and climatic variations. What does the key skill tell us we need to do? We need to be able to explain these characteristics and how they influence the Australian environment before humans. Let's look at how this has been assessed in past years on past exams. So I'm just going to show you some screenshots of past VCAR exams and what the questions look like, and then we're going to do a little summary at the end of this. So here, describing the three characteristics that led to the development of Australia's unique flora and fauna. In 2013, pick a characteristic and describe how it shaped the Australian environment before human habitation. Another one, here we go, we've got all three of them laid out for us. Now we just need to describe each of these characteristics and how it led to a unique and diverse Australian outdoor environment. In 2016, with this one, you got the list of them again and you had to write about one of them for 3 marks. If we go to 2018, here they are again, listed for you. Here they're saying use specific examples and explain how these characteristics influence the development of unique flora and fauna in Australia. And then if we go to last year's exam, not listed for you, okay, which I thought was good. Just saying there are three characteristics, so you had to identify those three characteristics for 3 marks, and then to get the rest of the other 6 marks for this one, you had to explain how these characteristics influence the Australian environment. So what do you need to do for this dot point? So in summary, what do you need to know for this key knowledge dot point? So in past years, you've had to recall all three of those characteristics. You've had to describe all three of those characteristics. You then had to explain how these characteristics have shaped or influenced the Australian outdoor environment, or this unique environment that we find here in Australia. You need to have specific examples to support your answers. Know that it's ranged from 2 to 9 marks, so 9 marks being pretty significant, that's worth 10% of an end of year exam. And lastly, it's usually one of the first questions on the exam. So if you can just get mentally prepared for that, if it comes up on the exam, I think that puts you in a nice sort of frame of mind. There's a bit of predictability about the exam. All right, so what are these three characteristics? Here they are, and here's a little acronym, Big CV, to help you remember them. Remember, last year's exam, you had to know these and be able to identify them. They weren't given to you. So they are biological isolation, geological stability, and those climatic variations. Let's unpack these in a little bit more detail, one at a time. The first one we're going to look at is biological isolation. And what does that mean? What that means is when species are living basically on their own without any influence and evolving without any influence from other species. And this is what happened to Australia. About 50 to 60 million years ago, it broke off from Gondwana land and was its own separate island, evolving on its own without very little influence from any other species from any other land masses. And that's really unique on a global or Earth context, because if we have a look at this map over on the other side, most of the other continents where a lot of species are found, they're all connected, so they're all influencing each other. And what was happening on one continent was filtering down to another continent. However, in Australia, it was an island on its own, kind of doing its own thing, and because of that, we see a lot of unique aspects of that and how that's influencing the environment we see here today. So let's look at a little bit of what might be an answer that you might use to describe how biological isolation has influenced environments. So Australia's been biologically isolated from those other land masses for approximately 50 million years. As a result, we see species that are highly unique and in many cases unlike any other species around the world. And the platypus, which you see here in this image, is a really good example of that. So that is a species which is endemic to Australia. And that's a good word to use maybe when you're writing about biological isolation, to use this word endemic, because endemic means found from only one place. Okay? The platypus actually, when the European settlers came here and were sending samples back, it was actually thought to be a hoax because they thought, no, this can't be a real animal. There's nothing like this around the world that we see that's like got a beaver's tail, a duck bill, It's got the body of an otter, it's poisonous, it lays eggs. They just didn't think it was real, but it is, and it's a really unique species that we find here in Australia because of that biological isolation. Geological stability. So Australia has had low levels of volcanic and tectonic activity because we have this very thick continental crust. Earthquakes are not something that we need to worry about much in Australia, are they? Now that's nice because what it means is you can live not worrying about an earthquake that much. However, what it's meant, it's not good for our geology. It's meant that we have very flat landscape full of nutrient poor soils. And we have dry and arid lands. If we look at a map of Australia, it's mainly desert. So if you're going to be a successful species in Australia, you've had to adapt to this nutrient poor soils. And here's an example of a species which has done that, and it's called the pitcher plant. Now this species has adapted to combat these nutrient poor soils by actually preying upon insects. Now again, this is just one example of a species that's adapted to geological stability. You might have different examples that your teachers unpacked with you. And I know some schools look at plant species like the Banksia. And in fact, the Banksia is so highly evolved to our nutrient poor soils that if you actually plant one out in your garden and put a lot of fertilizer on it because you want it to grow really well, it actually will suffer because of that. And it's almost like it gets an overload of nutrients and it will kill that plant. That's how highly adapted to it, the geological stability and those nutrient poor soils we have here in Australia. Again, you might have lots of different examples. That's fine. I'm just trying to show you some examples of what good writing looks like in regards to these, and we're just revisiting these concepts. And lastly, the last one of these characteristics is climatic variations. So we know it, we live it. We know that Australia has a very variable climate, and it can range from extremes. So we can go from drought from 8 to 10 years, and that's generally known as El Nino. We are affected by this El Nino-La Nina effect here in Australia. And then we can go to periods of high rainfall associated with La Nina. So if you're going to again be a successful species, you've had to adapt to these climatic conditions, which are often quite harsh in Australia. So an example of that is the koala's brain, which has decreased in size over time to conserve energy. Other things a koala has done, it can get all of its nutrients and hydration just from eucalyptus leaves. So that's another example of how it's evolved to survive these climatic variations. If we even look at the plant species, the eucalyptus, it often relies on fire in order to release its seed pods and regerminate. So there's another example of species that have adapted to these climatic conditions and then been successful. So now if you go to your answer booklet, and let's have a look at an answer for question 1B on page 3. So you might want to pause the video if you need to, get that answer booklet out, and we're going to look at a sample answer for this. And if you want, I'd recommend you getting your highlighter out and really annotating those answers that you've got in your answer booklet. Hopefully you've been able to print that out. All right, this question is asking us to describe each of the characteristics identified in part A. So if we have a look at this answer, this is going to be very similar to the text that I've just gone through, now just put in an answer form. So if we have a look at these three characteristics, okay, we see biological isolation, talking about Australia being separated from other land masses for millions of years. What's a result of that? We have highly unique species, unlike any other species found around the world, and the example of that being the platypus. If we move to the next one, we're talking about geological stability, about Australia having a thick continental crust, a flat landscape of nutrient-poor soils, dry arid lands, and we see species like the pitcher plant have adapted to basically get these nutrients they need from preying upon insects. And then lastly, looking at climatic variations. Knowing that Australia often goes through these dry periods of 8 to 10 years, which might be known as drought or El Nino, to periods of high rainfall. Okay, we often see floods in Australia. Just this year, we've seen bushfires, obviously the devastation of this summer's bushfires, but then we've seen flooding since. Okay, not many countries in the world that have those extremes. If we go to those extremes, we have a look at how's that shaped species here in Australia. We see that species such as the koala have adapted, and they've changed as a result of being influenced by this characteristic. And one of the adaptations they've made is that their brain has decreased in size over time to conserve energy. All right, there's a sample answer for 3.1.1.